Hello everyone, welcome to Retrogaming 101. I am Nick from the Nickscast, and we have a podcast and some other stuff that you can check out, but that's not why you're here. You're here about Retrogaming. I'm here with my friend Nick.
Hey, I'm Nick Z. So for clarity, it's a Z. Just trust me.
And my other friend Nick.
Like, gee, not kidding.
Yeah, no, we're
Since
all
high school.
This is not a
Yes.
this is not a drill. We are here to talk about Retrogaming 101. Primarily, what is it? How do you get started? All those kinds of questions. And before we get started, just if you do have any questions, just put up your hand and we'll try to get to you, or even if you just have a comment.
Can everybody hear us unmiked?
That is a great question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Perfect.
Awesome.
There's lots of space up in the front. Just come on up.
Scooch closer.
Oh, okay, that works. I think the biggest question when talking about retro gaming is, what is it? Because a lot of people have a lot of different definitions of it.
Yes.
The games that were made before I was born.
Cool. Super helpful.
I mean, that's not totally entirely true though, because that's like, I mean, that's the variable of when were you born into it, right? So it's going to be different for different people.
Yeah, it's like, what was the best era of Saturday Night Live? The one when I was watching, right? It's a lot of it is tied into nostalgia. Like in my personal head canon, nothing past Super NES feels like it should be called retro, but we've moved quite beyond that in terms of retro gaming.
Yeah. I found a couple different useful delineations for where that line starts. And one of those is I have these fiddly little pointy bits that won't fit into my HDMI television.
And that's you need a CRT TV to play them.
Yeah, well, so that is actually a useful point of demarcation. The transition from HD from component composite S video to HDMI. But then also that happens to coincide with the sixth generation of gaming, which was GameCube and PS2, which I think were just the precursor to HDMI hadn't caught on quite yet. It wasn't until the Wii and that era of games, which was what do I have here? But yeah, the PS3, Xbox 360. That's cool. HDMI is a thing that any console can just do now. It may not be 720p, it may not be 1080p, but it'll do HDMI, so you can just plug it into your television.
As we were talking about before, that's when they stopped counting the bits.
Yeah. Yeah, because people will refer to retro games as okay, this was an 8-bit game, this was a 16-bit game, this was a 32-bit game. They don't usually say this was a 64-bit, 128-bit,
No.
etc. Not a useful indicator of that.
No.
No, it kind of fell off. I guess once the move to 3D was firmly made, bits kind of became irrelevant. It was all about polygons.
The amount of polygons
Yeah,
that you can stick on your character.
I don't know if anybody here remembers, but I think it was when the N64 was coming out. One of the PR people from one of the major companies, Sony or Nintendo, came out and said something like, "Oh, our system will have millions of polygons," and that was a big deal then, because millions of polygons meant you could have photorealistic graphics on your N64 or PlayStation 1 or whichever one it was.
Millions of polygons. That's how many polygons a person has, right?
Exactly.
I mean, to some degree that makes sense, right? A lot of graphics rendering today is based off of that idea of how much can I render on screen, and that allows a higher fidelity.
Yeah.
But back then it would have also been completely meaningless, because when we render 1,000 polygons, it's cool. Even something as simple as this shape might have a ton of polygons, and that doesn't help with lighting and shading and things that didn't really exist in that era of gaming. I also wanted to mention that when we talk about retro gaming, we're not talking about things that are retro inspired, say Undertale or what is it? Shovel Knight is a fantastic example.
Yeah.
Even though so much work went into making sure that it's this is the same color palette. This is the chiptunes can be played on an NES because it's using the same synthesizer software. Even though all that effort went into it, it's still not really a retro game. It's retro inspired. Games like La Milana, which are designed to look like they were an MSX game or TurboGrafx, I think is what it was called here. or even games that just have a pixely aesthetic, like Hyper Light Drifter, which is definitely not in any sense. It's good. It's not super long. It's pretty challenging.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I was gonna say it's like Dark Souls, but no, it's not that hard.
No, it's not that punishing.
No. I don't know where you guys wanted to move on to next.
Yep.
So then also Cave Story would fit also within the
Yes.
Cave Story is an interesting one because it was designed to resemble older consoles, but it was just a PC game released in like the early 2000s, late
I think it was
90s.
like released in 2005.
Yeah.
Re-released again.
And again. And
Switch.
again.
And again.
Yeah. Talking about Chrono Trigger over here. Sorry?
Yeah.
I cross-played code and anime.
Oh, cool.
Nice. So there's a lot of like people in admiration of retro games incorporating that into new games.
Yeah.
I feel like we've hit the top of like the graphics got to be more realistic. I think everyone's like kind of okay with you know the graphic ability of a lot of games now. So some people are just like, you know what, I'm gonna go make like a 16-bit or 8-bit game like Hyper Light Drifter, which has that pixely look, but like the animation is so smooth.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like looks like it never could have been done back then, but with
No.
the same aesthetic.
Yeah.
So just using that to make new games, I think, is kind of a cool thing that people are doing.
Yeah. It's almost like Hyper Light Drifter is like a kind of an HD remake of
like an NES
maybe
game.
a SNES game.
One of the things that I found interesting, because I wanted to make sure we were prepared for this panel, because retro gaming has such a wide variety of meanings to different people, was looking at the differences between the different generations of gaming and the different challenges that you would run into necessarily trying to emulate or play, or however you wanted to experience the older generation of games. Because like the first generation of consoles, which is I think not something that people talk about at all, they were native consoles. You just had a device and it couldn't play any other games. It had only that one thing in memory or to that effect. It didn't have hardly any color. It might have one or two colors, or like color and the absence of color. And it had
Pong.
yeah.
Pong,
Well,
yeah.
I think Pong might have almost been in the second generation just by virtue of the things that it had been on. But it had single channel audio, and I was like, oh, single channel, so like mono. It's like, no. Single channel like has one signal going in, like beep. It's not until you get the second generation of consoles that you actually can like play a game by yourself, because the processor that they use is powerful enough to actually have like some sort of other agent on the machine doing simple programming. And it's not until the third generation that you even get into gaming that talking about when, you know, it's like retro is anything after I was or before I was born.
Yeah.
For me, you don't get into it's not until the third generation that you get into that, where you actually have like a D-pad and buttons and like color palettes that you can actually kind of
Distinguish what things are.
yeah, or it's not ET. So, but like I was surprised to find out that there's actually a huge amount of distinction between the different generations up until you get to the fifth or sixth, where it's like, cool, we now have 3D technology as a thing. We can just arbitrarily make that better. We can increase the resolution. We can increase the number of polygons. We can make smoother, more textured, more lighted, more shaded things.
More nuanced things.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Like, in terms of that nuance, though, I mean, there's still some nuance to be found in retro games. I mean, that's part of the appeal, right? Like, there's, I don't want to say like a vintage nuance, but there's a charm to it, right?
Yes.
Otherwise, like, we wouldn't be here talking about it, because NES, outdated. Atari, outdated. Super Nintendo, outdated. Forget about it. They can't do photorealistic.
Well, it's like
million polygon animation.
I mean, it's quaint, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh man, look how young we were back then.
Yeah.
People, and you know, I think that's part of the reason people are making games like that now
Yeah.
because they're like, oh man, it's like when people will make an album using only vintage instruments because they like that old sound so much
Yeah.
that they want to use that palette. And what were you talking about? What was that thing that you said you didn't want to say?
Man,
Don't worry about it.
Remember what it was. So.
That's my train of thought.
That's okay.
Yeah.
So there's actually like a lot of little distinctions between the generations. I think what a lot of people might be interested in, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, is you might want to play retro games, and the question is how? How do you even get started doing that? Which is its own complicated path of how true to the original experience do you want it to be?
The truer you want it to be, the more difficult it is.
Well, it's certainly the more
Yeah.
expensive.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm sorry.
So I mean, you can buy a bunch of them on Steam, I'm sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
Like at entry level, easiest if you just want to get the game, Steam or a bunch of virtual consoles.
Yep.
Yeah, so like if you don't mind playing like a port or a re-release or a remake, then you can definitely try to find like, well, using Chrono Trigger as an example, it's like, okay, well, you can play it on your iPhone or your Android. I wouldn't recommend that, but you can do that. Or you can get the DS re-release, or you can get the PS1 re-release, or you can, well, both of which might be harder to find on, say, eBay or something like that. But for other games, like Cave Story, which have been re-released on the Switch or Steam or Virtual Console or whatever,
Yeah.
there's lots of different ways to get re-released games, and those will be pretty good because they might have had included updates from previous versions of the games, either bug fixes or better translations or just anything that might improve the game. I haven't had a lot of experience where playing through a retro game that's been re-released and had it been a worse experience. I know that with Chrono Trigger in particular, people like have differences of opinion on like the translation.
Yes.
And I think I've
Yeah.
seen similar things with the Game Boy Advance port of Tales of Fantasia versus the
Yes.
Super Nintendo fan translation.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, with that in particular, apparently Tales of Fantasia, for those who don't know, was a Super Famicom JRPG, only released in Japan originally. And what happened was that this was during the time of the internet's sort of infancy, but a ROM of the game got out on the internet, and it was in Japanese, of course, but people wanted to play it. So some people who were, I guess, Japanese language enthusiasts, video game enthusiasts as well, translated the game. And that's the version that a lot of people experienced first, because they had emulators, they downloaded the emulator, downloaded the ROM from zoharsdomain.com or whatever, and played that on their PCs, their Macs, what have you. And then in mid-2000s, Nintendo released Tales of Fantasia on the Game Boy Advance, but they rushed the translation so badly that there's a sword in the game called Ragnarok, and like the autocorrect or the Google Translate that they were using to translate it, translated the sword's name as kangaroo, and that's there in the game. So if you get that sword, you just get this sword called Kangaroo, and it's really weird.
Bestows no jumping abilities whatsoever.
No, not at all.
Okay, so
Actually, I bought that game, and
Ooh.
the real thing really take around was that a lot of the music was missing too.
Yes.
do you mean like the original, like the opening theme and
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then yeah. I mean, like in the original, one of the things that set Tales of Fantasia apart in the original and made it so impactful for me when I first played it was that I gotta calm myself down here. It has its own J-pop theme song, and I mean, like it's on a Super Nintendo game, so it's compressed a lot, so it's kind of tinny and echoey and a little staticky, but it sounds really cool for the era, and it adds a lot of charm to the game. But because the GBA's hardware isn't the same as the Super Nintendo's hardware, they couldn't copy that exact thing, so they just cut it out. And it's just like, it's still a nice instrumental that plays over the opening, but it's just not as emotionally powerful.
So it wasn't because like I believe that sound file took up like half of the available space for the game
Yeah.
or something like that. Like
Yeah.
they had to use up all the space on the cart, and they didn't have that restriction on the Game Boy Advance,
No.
but it's just they couldn't make it sound nice on the ported version because
Yeah.
there's different sound synthesizers
Yes.
on the two.
Yes.
Okay, so there's an example where you can
Yeah.
get a re-release or a port that may not hold up. I think there was actually a really interesting example from recently with I think it might have been Kingdom Hearts. Did either of you? I think the original they wanted to re-release Kingdom Hearts, but they couldn't actually port the game because they'd actually deleted the source code for like Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2. So the re-release they had to like build the game up from the ground up.
Wow.
So there's another possibility where you could be playing a port or a re-release and it could very much be a different game. You're like, I remember this operating a bit differently. It's right because we had to make it with the new engine or something to that effect.
But couldn't you get the source code from the disc itself?
I don't know a lot about video game programming. It's possible that it's just in one giant data blob, but I mean, obviously, people have been able to take old games, pull out different sprite sets or the data libraries or whatnot. I think that's actually what they ended up having to do. They couldn't get the original source code, but they managed to like pull a number of assets and things off of the original disk to help with it. But they still had to do a lot of work to like remake the game.
Yeah, comment?
I was just gonna say that once the game's on like a cartridge or a disc, it's like in a language that only the console or PC can understand, and it's all just compiled and just unreadable. Like it's just garbage. Yeah, just looking at it, any kind of like hex program or something. So it's you can grab assets off of it, you can encrypt that stuff up, but the source code is just impossible to read.
Yeah, but basically you can decompile it, but you're never going to get like the original source code. There's always going to be stuff that's missing that kind of got lost when you decompiled it.
Yep, that makes sense.
One thing I wanted to say in terms of like, Tails was only for the Super Famicom, for example. So like, I feel like people of retro gaming is people who were around during that era but feel like they missed out on a lot of stuff. Yes. Or like you rented it once and then it was gone or someone had saved over your file or something like that. So I had an experience. I remember I went with a bunch of people to a trivia tournament in Philadelphia. We were all just sitting around shooting the breeze in the hotel room. And we started talking about games, and I'm like, oh, there's one where like Mickey Mouse was dressed as like a sultan. He can shoot magic, and the three people sitting on the bed jumped up. We're like, yes! The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse. I think I only ever played it once, but it was like it was such a weird moment that everyone was so excited to have remembered that game.
Yeah, I remember that game.
Well, and talking about oh, I'd really like to experience that game. Even if you've played it in the past, it's like sometimes a port or a re-release might not make sense. People all the time are like, why doesn't Nintendo just put all of their games on a mobile console? It's like on your phone. It's like, okay, well, because a port or a remake may not make as much sense when you just put it on a different device, right? Like playing a Game Boy game might make sense to play on to emulate it on a PC or to play it on another home console, but if you're playing a platformer or something on your phone, that is a very different experience. And so that process of porting can change a game in ways that may not be ideal. That's like one of the most obvious downsides to a game like that.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, but this might be jumping, but I guess licensing would be another problem. Say, like, Sailor Moon, another story, for example.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Well, licensing is its own beast.
That's its own path.
Yeah. Well, it's like, okay, we'll talk about copyright strikes and licensing. No. But ports and remakes aren't the only way that you can experience old games.
Hey, you can get an SNES Mini. Or are they already sold out? I don't know.
They're on their way to do
Anyway, sorry, continue.
Well, the SNES Mini is a really good example of it's not quite emulation or a re-release. You can, I think Atari has done this, and maybe Midway. They've released little tiny dedicated boxes that have like a best of library or specific games, and that obviously works if it has the games that you want, because hopefully there's been a lot of care and thought that goes into the games that are on there, and trying to make the it all depends how it's going on under the hood, whether it's just running a like MAME emulator or something like that, but probably it's going to give you a truer experience than just running thing off an emulator. Although for something like the Atari 2600, an emulator can probably just emulate it just fine, I'm just assuming. But that is like an in-between step, or an SNES Mini or the NES Classic, or I think Sega's trying to release like a Sega flashback with
yeah.
for Mega Drive / Sega Genesis games.
With like 30 good games and 60 games that no one knows what they are, or something like that.
Oh my goodness.
Just to pump up the
So
numbers.
so Sonic 2, Sonic 3,
Yeah, yeah.
Sonic and Knuckles, Comic Zone.
Yeah.
That's like 5 of the 30
Probably.
games right there.
If they've got the license for it, Aladdin.
Oh, it's a good game.
on both the Genesis and the SNES, Aladdin was a really cool game.
Oh my goodness. But if you're not doing something like the flashback, then you can do emulation, and emulation has gotten ridiculously good now. There was a point in time I remember where people were like, "Oh, I'm going to try using this Dolphin emulator to play some GameCube games," which for me was weird because that was still a console that I was familiar with.
Yeah.
But you had, like, it's gotten to the point where people have like, oh, we've had problems with specific games, but even those specific games have been worked around the different bugs in the software. For the longest time, Wind Waker wasn't running particularly well in the Dolphin emulator, but then a vigilant programmer managed to find out, it's like, oh, they use these different memory programming tricks to render the graphics so we can make it look the same. And then emulation has its own benefits, like being able to render higher quality textures or manipulate time in the sense of like save states or
yes.
fast forward, or, being able to program the inputs, being able to do cheat
Yeah.
codes.
That like help create speedrunning, or at least tool-assisted
Tool-assisted
speedruns.
speedrunning.
Yeah.
Like oftentimes people will obviously go through a speedrun and they can do it not tool-assisted, but there's a really amazing, I think it's Smash Brothers Melee playthrough with Fox and Falco, and they're doing these things that seem absolutely absurd. They end up fighting below the bottom of the Final Destination stage, and also manage to get back up on top, like right underneath. And it's because doing it on an emulator or using some other tool, they can they know all the different hitboxes and tricks in that game to get back up. That's an aside. But like when
same as Melodic, because Falco's shine is different as well.
Oh, okay.
okay. Not going to get into that.
Yeah.
But like when you have the ability to emulate things, you suddenly have more possibilities that didn't exist. Emulation obviously exists in I want to say it's gray, but it's definitely not legal.
What are you talking about? If you own a legal copy, then you can just emulate everything, right?
Oh yes, I have all 500 or whatever
Yeah.
SNES games, and that's totally legitimate.
Yeah, well, one cool thing about tool-assisted speedruns actually is that for like the first while, when speedrunning became popular, those were like very separate, and it was like, oh, the tool-assisted speedruns are cool, they can show us kind of some strategies, but they're not really, like they're doing things that are just impossible. But actually, as time's gone on, a lot of like one-frame tricks and like pixel-perfect tricks are like totally doable by humans, and they just do them kind of consistently now. It's really amazing how that's like driven the skill of these games.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to drive you away, but I remember when looking at the schedule this morning, there was a panel on speedrunning
Yeah.
at the same time.
Well, it's
Yeah.
actually at 11.
Oh,
it's all
guess
good.
where I'm going.
So that's a perfect segue from our panel.
Also, emulation. I don't know where I was going with that, but emulation is pretty approachable now. You don't even necessarily need to figure out what the best emulator is. I have a device called the Pocket Chip, which is a little, really big, really small computer that's billed as being like smaller than a banana, which there are lots of those now. And it has a little screen, and there's an emulator, a front end for emulation devices called RetroArch, and so I was running Chrono Trigger on this stupid little device because this emulator has front ends for all the different cores. You just need to figure out which one, whether it's ZSNES or Medna fan, I think. There's a ton of different emulators, and if you don't want to mess around with software because that's not your thing, you can get a truer experience with like a Retron 5 or any of the different Hyperkin devices or things like that, which will read the ROM off of a real cart, so you can do that and play all your classic games with like HDMI output and all the other fancy things that an emulator would give you.
Or if you want to add a little bit of nuance to it.
Or you can play Chrono
If you-
Trigger on an NHL Stanley Cup ROM.
Well, I mean, that's one thing you can do. I was actually going to go in the direction of homebrew. If you happen to
that's
have a
true.
Wii, because Wiis aren't updating anymore, and they're easier to homebrew than GameCubes, as far as I know. You could install homebrew onto your Wii through whichever method you choose. There are several, and then get one of those emulators on there, and then it's kind of like you're playing on a console, even though kind of not, because they've got a PlayStation emulator for the Wii, which I love because I never had PlayStation growing up. Speaking to your point, I feel like I missed a lot of stuff. Anyway, it's my 2 cents.
Yeah, okay.
That's the homebrew angle.
Okay. Oh, I was also going to mention that like some different consoles obviously either emulate directly or have the same hardware as previous generations. So I think like the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance all had previous support for Game Boy consoles.
Yeah.
But a better example might be like the early edition of the PlayStation 3, which I was like, how's it running these old games? And I think it actually just had like the hardware for a PS2 built inside of the PS3. And they stopped doing that because it was expensive.
Yeah.
That stupid Wii emulator on the Wii U.
Yeah.
It's the worst.
Well, I mean, didn't Nintendo do the same thing with the Wii to make it backwards compatible with GameCube? Wasn't there like a special bit of hardware in there that
Probably.
did that?
I don't remember that particularly well, but it's very likely that they did something like that, especially if the hardware was inexpensive.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I want to talk about with for the appeal of retro games is if you go far back enough, it's like one thing that makes it feel different from games now is like it's like plug and play. You put Mario in 15 seconds, you're playing. Instead of like a few load screens and you want to start a new game and like the opening crawl. It's like
Don't forget, like I bought this brand new game. I better run a whole bunch of updates.
Yes.
oh
Yes.
my god.
Or I bought this new game on Steam. I need to install the DirectX runtime for the umpteenth
Yeah,
time.
Mario Brothers has no DLC. It's just Mario in his brown shirt and like your afterwards. Yeah.
I guess one thing I just thought of that distinguishes a lot of retro gaming from newer gaming, going back to the thing of they had more limitations back then. Now we can just kind of get arbitrarily fine, like you can't really even detect how many frames you're seeing or how many polygons you're seeing. So back in the day, the developers were so much more limited. They had to be a lot more creative. Like on an NES, like you couldn't really make like really fine sounds. So like they were just using these little scratchy things for symbols or like all this weird stuff. They would be really creative and like you could almost look back at like the original Super Mario Bros. And depending on like how close you look at it, you're like, this is literally just squares. Like, there's nothing here. But back then, it was like, wow, super realistic.
He's got a shine on his hat.
Or like, what was it? It's like, oh, we couldn't distinguish between his arms and his face and his overalls, so we gave him a mustache. Like every little,
Yeah.
because they had such a set of constraints, they had to make every little detail count. And the further towards the present you get, those details became less and less important because, like, don't worry, we'll just make it higher resolution. You can see the football players' pores on their skin. You can see the pores on Mario's face.
It's so weird because it's like it started out as like this is the NES representation of a person as Mario, and now he's a weird alien who's not quite human. But he's just Super Mario Odyssey.
Oh yeah, that's
He's this weird kind of lumpy cartoon guy, and when in the real world.
Well, at least in New Donk City.
Oh, in the world of Mario, he's fine.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I guess.
I mean, he's just your standard 25-year-old plumber, right?
The other thing about the constraints in the different games is that different. This is not something I knew until playing a lot more games. Is that playing a ROM or something to that effect, you're like, oh, okay, every game is just a game. It played on the Super Nintendo, so obviously all the Super Nintendo games just work the same way, which is not true. Star Fox had like the Super FX chip, which let it do that really weird pseudo 3D kind of work. But other games did things like that too, that weren't just making more space for the game. They gave it better sound synthesizing. They gave it better, I think it was one of the Mega Man X games. that had a similar. It wasn't the Super FX chip, but there's a moment where you're fighting like the final boss, and it's like a wireframe.
Oh yeah.
And so there wasn't any libraries in the built-in ROM or RAM for the Super NES. They have a chip that's only job is to do like some vector math to draw a face rotating.
Mode 7.
I mean, Mode 7 allows you to do the layering, but it
Yeah.
doesn't allow you to do like the math to rotate a 3D model. Oh, sorry, was there a hand up back there? No, somebody's just yelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Mega Man X2. Also, I feel like Donkey Kong Country, those games were different. I don't know if they had like a
They
different
were-
chip or anything, but there was something different going on.
They did some photorealistic, yeah.
Yeah.
And they animated it after.
Yeah, so it looks realer, but it's just like we've taken a model and we just
like Mist.
Kind
see.
of.
There's a game I haven't played.
Kind of
Oh,
like
no,
Myst,
PC.
except instead of taking like photographs and digitizing them, they were like 3D models, I guess 3D models, and they digitized those.
They did that with Super Mario RPG as
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
Yes.
where they had little 3D models of Mario and whatnot, which looked great when you're reading Nintendo Power,
Yeah.
and then they looked okay in the game by comparison.
That's
Yeah.
I mean, they still look realistic to me.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So the thing I found interesting.
Sorry.
Sorry, I love Myst.
Okay.
It's really hard for me to find people that like Myst as much as I do. I'm kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was just like an old PC exploration game where they had higher graphics than what you could achieve at the time by just having like a series of pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just gonna say one thing. I was playing Super Mario RPG the other day, and there's that part in Booster's Tower where you go behind the curtain and then you become 8-bit Mario.
Oh, yeah.
So already they're like, look how young we were, a few years ago. Look at the quaintness. There's also, I think, Link in 8-bit in the Rose Town Inn or something like that.
Oh yeah, and Metroid's like, yeah, that's funny when you mention it. It's like, oh, this is
Yeah.
even more. We're making fun of how old this
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
I got into the Legacy of Kain games.
Okay. Yeah.
Are you familiar with that?
Not super
really.
familiar.
Yeah.
No.
Basically, you play as a prince turned into a vampire because he wanted blood, and this necromancer turns into this one, and then there's this other like best friend. It's kind of like a take on like Cain and Abel.
Okay.
And I actually at a little job met one of the game guests.
Oh wow.
Of
Oh,
the
cool.
game. It was pretty cool.
Nice.
I think one of those was definitely made by Silicon Knights.
So fun, yeah.
Really?
Oh, they.
Yeah, they made Eternal Darkness.
Was that the one that operated at St. Catharines?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's a local. Well, it's like it's a Canadian, it's an Ontario
Yeah.
game development
Yeah.
studio. They did not. I don't remember what happened to them.
The only other.
Yeah, no, they got embroiled in a bunch of controversy.
Yeah.
When making, what was that game, Too Human? Yeah.
Huh.
Like, I don't know, licensing issues with the Unreal Engine, they like modified stuff that they weren't supposed to modify.
The downfall of every game is too bad to be played. There is, of course, if you don't want to emulate games, you can spend a lot of money,
Yep.
Yes.
and you can buy the original consoles.
Mhm.
If you're fortunate, you may have some of the original consoles.
My
Or know
ex
someone who
ended
does.
up
Held on to
getting an S at a garage sale for $8.
Wow.
Nice.
I got
Yeah.
a Super Nintendo somewhere in my room.
You're like, I know it's in this quadrant of my room.
I have two Super Nintendos. I don't know how. I don't have the cords for either. I just have the
This is-
$2.
This is the so we had a Nintendo growing up, like the NES, and we lived in a rural area. And this is going to sound even weirder. My brother and his friend, it's fairly rural. It's kind of like not quite redneck, but like kind of that kind of vibe. Anyway, so they went to the dump and they found an NES, and they definitely weren't supposed to be there, but they found one. And it works, so I don't really care. So now I have two, one that is a little bit cleaner and one that is a little bit less clean.
I think I have a yellow Super Nintendo. And,
Oh, but that's just the
Yeah, yeah.
weathering.
I've always been that way too.
Like,
Yeah.
Just a lot of time, sunlight, and this chemical I cannot remember.
Oh, to kind of remove all the aging wear from. Okay.
put it on the window next to my.
What I call retrograde, you can use to talking about. They use it for like old PCs that turn like
Monetizing everything.
Well, and speaking of that, it's like, okay, so I have my retro console, and I have this television. I can't even plug it in.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are different solutions to that. You can plug your component composite S video into some generic adapter that plugs into your HDMI, but that's not going to look good. A lot of old consoles, I put it at like 240 as an interlace signal, and then it just looks bad. There are devices that you can buy to fix that. I think there's something called the XRGB FrameMeister, which will do upscaling, which means it'll take your signal, try to do its best to like bring it up to a higher resolution using an algorithm to smooth out the edges so it doesn't just... Actually, no, it probably doesn't use an algorithm. It probably does a nice job of maintaining the pixel. It's like a nearest neighbor kind of thing. Yes, it's...
Yeah.
If you want to go down the vintage retro gaming route, expect to spend a lot of money.
But you'll get the authentic experience.
Yeah.
And the authentic experience, I would say, includes having to screw the little thing
Oh, the RF
into the
adapter.
back of the TV. It took me like 5 minutes to do that.
Yeah.
So
You don't want to bend the pin.
No.
the weird thing about that is
Worst.
that TVs still have a coaxial cable, so you
Yeah.
can. I think you can still do that.
I'm just going because I remember I know that I used to know this, but what was the deal with having to take it out, blow on it, and then stick it back in?
Oh.
What was that all about? I can't remember, and I'm just like, okay.
I mean,
know I should know this. I'm
I
old
mean,
enough.
the nominal idea was that it was getting rid of dust that was in there.
Yes.
But
Yes. Like
but I never blew into it and got dust back in my face.
Well,
So
that's my question. If it's plugged in, how does the dust get in there?
I feel like
Dust gets everywhere.
Okay, yeah, obviously.
I feel like people saw other people doing it,
Yeah.
and now it's almost like, oh, if I gotta do this. I gotta blow into the cartridge, right?
It's like, I don't know if anybody here plays Pokemon, but if you were playing Pokemon in the first generation, I don't know where I got the idea, but like if you're catching a Pokemon, it's in the ball, you like paddle between left and right, it makes it more likely you'll catch it, right?
Left and right with the A button.
Yeah,
A
hold
button,
down.
yeah.
There are games where I just hold down B for the entire game because I thought it made me go faster. I don't think that's true for most games.
Yeah, but like blowing into the cartridge, I mean,
If
doesn't do anything. It's even worse for it. Apparently.
well, because you're introducing moisture, and then moisture corrodes the
Yeah.
little anodes, and I think it might have kind of worked because maybe you got moisture on it, and then it helped be a little bit more conductive. But then, then as soon as you plug it in, then it's like, okay, well, now there's a connection, and then I don't know. It probably didn't short, but eventually the spit dried up, and then it's like, cool, there's no connection. But the problem was always that the pins weren't connecting very well,
I
either
mean-
because you were ramming it into the device or because they just weren't away.
And it seems it seems like a quick let's do this instead of getting at the Q-tip and like cleaning all the pins.
Yep,
and,
yep.
I think I had Bugs Bunny's Birthday Bash, and I got to the point where you could. It was a bad game, don't. And I got to the point where you could blow in it and it would whistle. Like you'd hold it this way and you'd blow in it and it would go. Heet.
Did it still work?
It doesn't work anymore. I think the cartridge is literally falling apart. There's a hand over here.
Thank you, it was mine. Just out of curiosity, since you said like retro gaming, the term has different meanings for different people, what do you guys consider retro? Because like I have my own ideas. Because I'm still personally I'm still struggling to think. Is like, does N64 count as retro?
See, I'm in your boat. SNES and before is retro to me.
Because like I grew up in a
2D.
like Super Mario. Vigilante 8 was my favorite game on the system. And on top of that, how do you guys feel about like the new generation who clearly wasn't born when those systems were made, like when they're trying to go for it, or your general kind of reaction to them reacting to their games?
Depends on the reaction.
Like if they play something as old as Contra.
Yeah.
then-
Well,
Yeah.
for some people, I'd have the same disdain when people are like, I don't watch black and white movies. I'm like, well, give it a shot, and if you're not, don't worry about it. But I'm interested to know why those people are interested in those old games, because it can't be nostalgia, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's like, there are 8 fragillion Mario games. I want to see the first one. There might be, digging up the past.
Which one's the first one?
Donkey Kong.
Okay,
Wouldn't it-
just checking.
Would it be Mario Bros?
Wrong question to ask.
What about your definition of?
Oh, I was
retro?
going to be lazy and skip over to you, but I can actually answer. I would probably put the N64 into the retro boat. I'm on the other side of that, just because it was the cartridge-based games were still a thing. Talking about people's approaches to retro games and giving them a shot and things like that. I'll be honest, much like the black and white, I don't have any particular love for first and second generation consoles. I had an Atari 2600 and I remember having the darndest time just trying to get it to work most of the time. And I remember having a copy of ET and trying to figure out what was going on. I had no idea. I remember his neck getting really long. But at the same time, I play a lot of indie retro style games now. I played VVVVV. There's 6 or 8 V's or something like that. And that's, is it 6?
6.
Okay. That is a game that's very much going for a second generation console style. And so if I was talking with somebody about their reaction to those consoles, I mean, I think those constraints made for some really interesting games where now we can do anything and that sometimes means you get really good games, but oftentimes constraints help to stimulate creativity in a really good way. So
Yeah.
I also end up playing a lot of games that have all those weird constraints, and Shovel Knight is an amazing shout out to classic Capcom games and has a Capcom music producer from the Mega Man series, and it's just amazing. If you haven't played Shovel Knight, you should be playing Shovel Knight. But
And they just keep releasing whole new games.
I think they've done the last release of it.
Oh, you think this one?
I think King Knight was the last one that they'd planned. They might do more in the future. But so I don't have any particular malice towards people that don't like older consoles, because if you grew up today, then you've got the full 3D first-person shooter, everything. You can do whatever kind of gaming you want. And so if you come back and play first generation of Pokemon, you're like, nah. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. It's weird like that.
Yeah, for me, definitely N64 is where the retro cutoff is. N64, PlayStation 1, probably GBA as far as handhelds.
The jump to 3D is when.
Yeah, well, I would include that in there. To me, that's retro, because it is that jump to 3D. It is totally different from all the 2D games, but there are still a lot of rough even in my speech, a lot of rough edges, right?
I had, for some reason, one of my favorite games on the PlayStation 1 was the Phantom Menace game.
Oh man,
I love that game.
Yeah, but in retrospect, it's
the racing one?
Oh no!
No, the story one.
Movie one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't play that one.
Love
that.
It was so glitchy that they had a cutscene where all the pod racers are lined up and then they go, but 3/4 of the time I played the game, the pod racers weren't rendered. So you're just seeing Qui-Gon Jinn and family just sitting there, just being like, "Look at him go!" And I'm like, as a kid, I'm just like, I guess I have to use my imagination. I guess they couldn't afford to, render the scene. So okay, I'll go. But yeah, kind of for me, glitchiness is part of the retro thing.
Yeah.
Going on the thing, or the game's not working, or when the cable would twitch a little bit and the lines go and you're because even as a kid, I had the NES too. And for some reason, I had that Muppet game that is considered one of the worst games ever. And I considered the pixels going
It's on the Super Nintendo?
I swear it was on the NES.
Probably NES.
It was no music and it just weird. That was garbage.
And I swear you can find so many glitches
Yeah.
okay.
that are
Is that what this
Easter
looks like?
eggs too. That it's
Is that what his
just
peak is for?
Okay, what does this do? Oh, it does this.
Yeah, it's finding it part of the fun of retro games.
Sorry, was there a hand over here before there was the... Oh, okay, cool.
What do you guys think about retro games that fans have come to fix? So, for example, I can't think of any game other than Castlevania 2.
Oh, that's
made,
true.
Simon's Quest Redacted, which essentially they made sure that when night falls, it's not super long, it lasts a century, and they fix a lot of the inconsistencies in the game. What do you guys think of that? Do you think that removes from the retro-iness, or do you guys think it adds on? What's your opinion on it?
it might remove from the retroiness, but I am all for that. It's like having, like, if you're a big fan of those games, it's kind of like having new content, which is not really going to happen for most retro games. So I'm in all favor of like people being like, this, if it wasn't quite so balanced, or it would have been better if this happened. So yeah, I'm like, it's not as classic or original or as in the box or whatever, but I'm definitely all for that.
I think Wind Waker, the HD remake, both made it HD, but also they introduced a faster sail.
Yes, they introduced a faster sail. They removed a big part of the Triforce quest at the end, so you didn't have to collect all the maps and
Nothing wrong with that quest.
I loved it because Wind Waker is this game where you've got this huge ocean to explore, and that quest made you explore it, which was awesome.
Yeah.
But like,
the only problem is that you were slow.
Yeah.
You were really slow.
Yeah.
But that's what I was getting at is like, I don't think that diminishes from the original game. I think of that as being like a director's cut of an existing game. There are always going to be people who prefer the original or the reboot or whatever. Resident Evil also has like a ton of different remakes and re-releases and in different styles and whatnot, and each of them may have their charm. Sometimes that means that the original game really isn't worth playing. I can't think of any examples offhand, but like for me, I see those as different games. It doesn't necessarily diminish from the original thing, because the game is all about creating that experience. And in the case of Castlevania 2, having played only a little bit of it, like, it's not fun doing that part. It doesn't make me put more, like, if it was an arcade game, it doesn't force me to put more quarters into the game. It just wastes time. It's not an enjoyable experience for anybody. Having cryptic clues because the translation was bad is not a feature. That's a bug. I'm a software developer. That is just fix that.
What a terrible night for a curse.
I don't even get your reference. Let's say that just reminds me of like the way the Pokemon series has evolved, because like they kind of fix things as they go and like streamline things a little more. And it turns out I don't really want to play Red and Blue again. I just like the idea of Pokemon, and I think Sun and Moon is the best Pokemon game that's been released
so far.
So that one I don't like. I have fond memories playing it growing up, but I don't want to play it anymore because I know there's a much better version. So I guess that answers that. Yeah.
Yeah, you said about that you've never heard of a game where basically the original is rendered useless. Basically, I would have to say it with the Persona 4, don't play the original. Because it's clearly outdated and it's bad. I was there for the remake for the Vita. They fixed a lot out of it.
Okay.
There's like one Lucifer glitch.
Well, like, touching on that one more time before we probably move topics, there are still a lot of really valid use cases for, man, I'm definitely just shilling that speedrunning panel that we're definitely not.
Yeah, you should check it out.
Yeah, we did an episode of the podcast on speedrunning. It's really fascinating. But there are reasons that you might want to keep the original game around is because they have different advantages to other games. Japanese versions of the games tend to be shorter because they can use less characters to say more.
Yeah.
If you're playing a retro game from a speedrunning perspective, then you'll have different constraints than if you're playing a game to experience it for the story. If you're experiencing it for the story, like the PAL version of the NTSC version might have a different translation or different voice acting that make it worth playing for that reason. The PS1 version of Chrono Trigger has anime cutscenes and really slow load times.
Yep.
and the SNES version doesn't, but is fast.
Yeah.
So, like, what do you want? The DS version is superior.
Some like bugs get like fixed in future versions too, and then they can be exploited.
Yeah, and that could be work positively or negatively. We played through Final Fantasy VI, and I remember there's a lot of bosses. It's like, okay, Vanish Doom, done. We don't care about grinding and doing all that.
PSN, it kind of glitches out. Sometimes I had to reset the game because it black screened on me.
What?
Sometimes the old.
Am I actually playing Super Nintendo? This is really weird.
Sometimes the old bugs are gone, but new, more interesting bugs emerge.
I mean, that's going to happen unless they literally took the ROM or the ISO and just put it up.
You?
Oh, I'm just
okay.
Yeah. Also, there are other ways to enjoy. All right, so vintage gaming is expensive.
Yes, it is.
And maybe emulation is not quite the right level of verisimilitude. You want something a little bit more true to that experience. There's halfway routes that you can take. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. You can like get adapters for your old controllers. You can buy USB versions of many of the different controllers.
True.
Plug them into your computer, and then you're like kind of getting somewhere in between those experiences. I think a lot of PCs now are powerful enough that you shouldn't have a lot of like frame skip or things like that unless you have a lot of things running in the background of your computer. So you could be playing your like Nintendo, PlayStation, etc. games on your PC and at least have that semblance of being able to be playing you can pretend you're playing the real game, even though it's probably all stretched on your widescreen monitor.
Yeah, it depends how authentic an experience you want to get.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but then you kind of run into the question of authenticity, right? Because, like, if you haven't played these retro games before, you know the stories, you know what they're sort of, like, I guess, supposed to look like. But I think a lot of the appeal for retro, at least for people who grew up with those games and now are going back to them, is that there's that kind of that magic of sitting in your living room, you know, with friends or by yourself, just on a rainy day, parking yourself on the couch and playing video games for hours.
Swap your modem out for 56K.
Yeah.
And, you know, grab a bottle of Orbits and
Like, how far do you want to go in recreating the experience?
Like, okay, but like in that case, it's like, all right, I'm gonna like, what, get some Retron device, plug it, like that's the problem, right?
Yeah.
If you could buy reproduction carts, it might be feasible, but you can't because they're legally not a thing.
Not so legal.
Yeah, not legal whatsoever. And if you know how to make reproduction carts, like, why are you here? You probably know more than I do. About flashing ROMs and things like that. But like that is what you want, and that is unfortunately the route where you pay for it.
Yeah.
There are people who have made like Raspberry Pi retro devices that have all the ROMs, and then you can have that experience. You can. Oh, nice! Did it have a little 3D printed case to look like a?
And he started playing Chrono Trigger. I didn't know he brought it in. And he started playing Chrono Trigger, and he's like, Sarah! I'm like, oh my god.
Because people do that. You can go on like Thingiverse, and it's like, here is a shell for one of these little mini computers, and you can 3D print your shell, so it looks like you're playing an old console. You might need USB ports, but and then you can do that, and you don't have to buy a Retron 5 because they're expensive. But like, if you want that sitting at home, you kind of need to go the vintage retro gaming route.
Yeah.
Or you need to buy other hardware, because if that's part of recreating the experience, it's the only way to do it. Going into your Steam library and playing your remaked version of Disgaea PC for the PS2 is not going to be the same as piping it into your PS2. Or Phantom Brave or whatever. Still haven't played that.
About 10 minutes. Is there anything that we haven't covered that people would like to talk about?
Favorite video game memories, retro, like glitches, weird personal anecdotes.
I don't know if anybody's familiar with the game Aiden Chronicles, also known as Adine Chronicles, depending on, I guess, your regional dialect. It's this N64 RPG made by H2O Interactive, which was a company from out west, Canadian company, and THQ. They published it, but it's like this Western RPG that's got heavy D&D style mechanics. Yep. And it's like, it has really deep systems, but it is notorious for having terribly ugly polygons, really dark environments that make it difficult to see what you're doing, and like a lot of jankiness. It was, and I bring this up because it was the first game that I was playing when I was a kid, where I ever actually got an error screen. It didn't freeze, it didn't lock up, but an actual error screen showed up, like with little debug code and all that stuff, and it would just happen, not randomly, but I kind of realized that if I had certain people in my party and walked over like this certain area of the map, it would almost always trigger.
Oh my goodness.
Brilliant.
And it was just like, I guess, my first glimpse sort of into how rushed games could maybe sometimes be a little bit buggier than other less rushed games. Still a really fun game.
So that reminds me of in FF6 where I essentially locked my keys in my car. So I left the airship in a place where I could not get back to it. Yeah, I like left the airship and like went down the river or something like that, and I couldn't get back to it, so I had to restart the game. Ooh, it was so bad.
I have a positive experience, but I wish I could reproduce it. I had like the old clunky Game Boy, and I was just playing Super Mario Land because I'd never beaten it, and I still haven't. But what had happened was
The ending's not that great.
no, I don't imagine it is. But what had happened was just because the cartridge was so old, the contacts had been corroded or whatever. I would. It was either I would die or finish a level. No, I would die, and it would skip me ahead to the next level.
What? So you could progress really fast if you
so I made it through like the first world, the second world, the third world, the parts of the game that I'd kind of made it to, and I was like, oh, I've never really made it any further than this. And then I died, and then it's like moving on to like 4-1 or 5-1. I'm like, wait, what? And all of a sudden I was in the air, and I was like, oh, I've never been this far. And then I died again, and then it's like I made it to the end of the stage, and there was the final boss, and I was just like,
Just sped run that game and got a world record.
just murdered yourself.
yeah. Well, I don't know.
Cartridge percent.
And then I was like, okay, maybe if I like, then I think the batteries died or something, and it's like I plugged it back in, and it just didn't work. So never to be reproduced ever again.
R.I.P.
There was probably at least one other occasion where I was playing some NES game and just the sprites went out of whack, and then you couldn't see what you were doing. But like that's not as exciting as that. I'm trying to think.
I don't know. This is a very quick one. But when we were talking about like why I consider, what I do retro, because I remember before the N64 and I remember the N64 coming out, so that probably has a lot to do with it. And I had a poster of Robotech Crystal Dreams in my room for years, and it never, ever came out.
Oh man.
Or did it? I don't after a while, I stopped looking.
And I'm sure everybody was like playing Pokemon. It's like, oh, you surf along here, and then you do this, or you
Under the truck.
Under the truck.
With Mew.
Yeah.
Well, but successful glitches like duplicating all the items in your inventory, or you're like trading with somebody, and you're like, I'm just gonna pull the link cable out now, and now we both have a copy of the Pokemon. Yay!
Oh yeah, one thing that I've never adjusted to is a lot of games now allow you to play them with other people. I always played my games by myself.
Yeah.
Or like even when I had these guys over, played a one-player game and they would watch.
Yeah.
Or
Skies
you
were
would play
Arcadia.
and I would watch. But yeah.
That's true. Like, I grew up playing games for immersion and escape.
Yeah.
So when games are now like with online and just like anything competitive, I'm not good with. Like if I'm playing Street Fighter with somebody, I suck. Not because like I can't learn, it's just because I'm not.
That's not.
It's not about that.
Well, yeah, that's why I'm not interested in competitive Pokemon at all, because like you have to play it in a particular way, and none of that is what I like about the game.
It's like Breath of the Wild is great for me because you can play that for hours and hours and just have a good time by yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like something recent, like I don't know, Grand Theft Auto, like the single player experience was great, and then they put all their energy into the online, and like I can't be bothered.
It's like, when I sit down to play a video game, I definitely want to hear 10-year-old people tell me how bad at a game I am. That's what I'm looking for. I don't get enough stress at work.
I'm streaming the Prompto DLC from Final Fantasy 15, and the guy's like, wow, you're really bad at driving the snowmobile. I'm like, yeah, you think? Thank you.
Magical things do happen.
It's like having your good friends in your living room right there with you.
I will say though, I was playing like the old Street Fighter 2 game, like not Turbo or anything. Just like the original fighters. 3 guys who were more experienced with the newer, faster games tried to game crash, and I schooled them just because the game kept going so slow.
So you're already accustomed to the pace, and they were like, "What is going on?"
I can see. I can see the code.
4 is in the hands of my second cousin for some reason. Like he's only like 17, and playing them in Smash Brothers, when they're so used to melee and like the Smash 4, they're like, "Where are the charge attacks? I can't stop playing." I'm like, you don't know. Like it's so like balanced and broken, which is like speaking of which, the Wii Switch put out the Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition thing out, and it's weird how they tried to capture the same frame lag, the same imbalanced character.
That's interesting.
It's breaking, like.
Yeah, and it's like they have like the pixelated 16-bit graphics, or they have the updated HD graphics, but it plays the exact same. And then I tried it, and I'm like, I don't know how I feel about this.
Probably had to.
I was just, when we were talking about, getting schooled by some 10-year-old on how crappy a driver you are, and I'm like, okay, I'm a professional driver. I drive for a living. Whoever is designing these games has no clue. One of the ways you know that something's going wrong is you can feel it in the vehicle.
Yeah.
I have sat down at a surround console at Schneider, and it's just not the same. And this is supposed to help make me a better driver. Because there is no resistance in the steering wheel. There is no reaction whatsoever from the vehicle. There's no vehicle. So if you're good at this, you're gonna suck as a driver. Like, I'm sorry.
There is at least one person who is, there's like a whole set of people who do a bunch of F1 simulation games, and this person who had gotten like to be the top rank went on to actually drive an F1 car, and while he was not the best, he actually like didn't crash and kill himself, and managed to like do pretty well.
But that's a very set environment.
Yes, yeah.
And that's why it's on a closed track, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And the same as
did you just say we're? Oh,
we're
simulator games for piloting, and it'll help you because you're learning to react to. That's again very specifically set up.
Yeah.
And those developers will have gone and said, okay, what's this like? How can we incorporate that into the game? Whereas, I'm sorry, Grand Theft Auto, no, they're mayhem.
Yeah.
You do not want to be driving like
You are
that.
driving a rock, and the rock moves this way because of the physics engine. That is all the time we have. Thank you, everybody, for
coming out.
Yes. Thanks, everybody.